situate us with more of the latest kind of regional political developments. And Helena Cobban, we're so honored to have you back
Mm.
to help us make sense of what's been happening in Syria over the last 10 days. It's unimaginable.
Well, one update is that what are we calling him now? Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, Ahmed al-Shara, who is the leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the Al-Qaeda offshoot backed by the United States and Turkey, who is now the de facto ruler of Syria, made his first comments to the foreign media today, and there's also video of him speaking, in which he makes no mention of the Israeli attack on the country whatsoever, which is
Right.
astonishing, really. And the only enemies he names of Syria are Iran and Hezbollah. So there doesn't seem to be any indication that the new de facto authority is planning to respond to this in any way.
No, I mean, it really seems like they're letting Israel enact whatever Israel has been planning for taking more of Syrian land. It's astonishing, but not surprising.
Yeah, so I've got a few items to take us through to kind of guide the discussion. Um, so, uh, well, just to list the items and then we can go through them from the beginning. So, the first one is the article that myself and Ali wrote on Monday explaining a lot of this. And then I think we could probably skip the second one now. John's covered that for the most part. And then we've got an update on some of the stuff that's been happening in Syria, just quickly, because we're not going to get into that in too much detail. And then a couple of analyses by Ali Hashem and Alistair Crook, and then the Iranian leader's most recent update about all this. So first of all, Tamara, the article, just if you could put that back up on the screen again. It's so we wrote this as a response to what happened in Syria, giving a kind of summary of the, as John said, the really fast moving events that have happened, the lightning fast moving events. And I'm not going to get into the whole thing, but just a couple of bullet points from it. So Israeli tanks were reportedly on the outskirts of Damascus early on Tuesday as Israel launched airstrikes across the country, being called the heaviest in the history of Syria. Netanyahu immediately claimed credit for the downfall of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, saying it was a historic day and a direct result of the blows we've inflicted on Iran and Hezbollah. We really explain in the article how what has been happening is, of course, viewed positively by some Syrians and, many people as, the overthrow of a dictator, but many other Syrians are, fearful of what could happen. And many people in the region are fearful of what could happen next. There's a lot of uncertainty. And of course, Syria was for decades the backbone of the axis of resistance to US hegemony. It was a vital land bridge for the supply of rockets to the resistance, advanced weaponry from Iran to the resistance in South Lebanon. And many people in the region view Assad's downfall as a strategic win for Israel and the US. And there's a lot more detail in the article, and we get into, for example, some of the rebel commanders anonymous rebel commanders have been speaking positively in the Israeli media about how they want to normalize ties with Israel and so forth.
Yeah, some of the reports I've been seeing and reading, and of course it's difficult to know exactly what's true and what isn't, but you can sort of sense what is plausible. And some of the reports are that over the last few years, both Iran and Russia, which were the main powers behind the Syrian government in recent years, and they make clear, the way they put it is, we weren't there to support Bashar al-Assad, We were there to fight these Al-Qaeda linked groups that threatened the region. That's how they put it. You can agree with that or disagree with that. But in recent years, they had pressed Assad to use the period of the truce since, what was it, 2016 or 2017 or around then, to rebuild the Syrian army, and that had by and large failed to happen. And of course, Syria is under such intense sanctions, and the central bank is cut off from the international financial system, that soldiers were being paid something like $10, $15 a month when these HTS and the other groups are being paid hundreds or even thousands of dollars a month, of course, by the foreign sponsors. And so you just couldn't really motivate them to fight. And at a certain point, the fear was that the army would break down. So it just had been hollowed out by the sounds of it. And then the assessment in the end is that it would be a bloodbath that wouldn't be redeemable anyway. I don't know if that's true, but it sounds plausible. And what's in it, a lot of people, a lot of the fear about the fall of the Syrian government, aside from central to this is what Syrian people want, and it is a divided society. Some people are very ecstatic about this, and others are very fearful and mortal fear of what the new rulers might do, just as many before were in mortal fear of the government that existed up to that point. But in terms of the regional dynamics, a lot of people felt, well, they looked at the map and they said Syria is the land bridge between Iran and the resistance in the south of Lebanon, Hezbollah. That's how the weapons come in. Syria is the strategic depth of the resistance. That's how people describe it. And so one conclusion some people come to, or one fear they have, is, well, now Hezbollah is isolated in southern Lebanon, and therefore Hezbollah will be fatally weakened. The question I have, both for Helena and perhaps for John too, is that the case, given that Gaza is even more isolated than southern Lebanon, and is, as we've just seen from John's report, is still fighting?
Yeah.
What can we say about that?
John first, if you want.
Do you want me to go first? Sure. I think it's overstated. The war, at least at this point, the transfers over the last 14 months, Israel has had carte blanche in Syrian airspace since October 7th. And as we know, for the decade preceding that, virtually, they had coordination with the Russians at most, and carried out strikes deep inside Syria, constantly trying to intercept, interrupt the development of strategic weapons shipments. It's an important part, there's no doubt. I mean, just even the fighters traveling overland for training is very important, but there are other ways to get weapons in. It's not advantageous to have Syria be cut off, but it's not. There's a lot of talk about that, like Syria is the backbone of the resistance, and I think we need to be very careful about those kind of statements. The Assad government was deeply unpopular. Its soldiers did not want to fight for it, so we can't be saying that is the backbone of the resistance, because it's just demonstrably untrue. There will be differences in the way that weapons can be transferred. There's different ways that fighters can move from place to place to train. It's a devastating loss of the sovereignty of an important country in the region, and the toll that the country has paid in the first 48 hours alone is testament to that. But writing off the capabilities of the resistance, particularly Hezbollah and especially Qassam, is not that's not a position that I agree with. I think that Hezbollah showed themselves to be uninvadable. That is the demonstration of their war with Israel, is that Israel cannot ground invade, cannot carry out mechanized maneuvers, cannot put concentrated infantry forces on the ground in South Lebanon. They were repelled from doing that. And the sovereignty of Lebanon is intact if this 60-day ceasefire goes as it is. The sovereignty of Lebanon will be intact. There's certainly going to be a disruptive period in weapons trade, but those weapons didn't come on a convoy of trucks all the way through Iraq and Syria. That's what was bombed. So that has been a problem that goes back multiple years before this weekend, when the world got flipped on its head in the Middle East. And as far as the Palestinian resistance they get manuals and training guides and tactical briefings, but the resistance in Gaza is built in Gaza. It's not dependent on arms shipments from Syria. It's dependent, insofar as it is dependent, it's on rhetorical support. And over the last 14 months, the Assad regime's rhetorical support for Gaza was virtually absent. And we maybe get into more about that when we talk about the political machinations, because Assad has been playing a game for this whole year to keep himself out of the October 7th, keep himself out of the axis of resistance. And so I think that there's a lot of discussion on social media about the backbone of the resistance being taken out. And I would urge caution on those kind of statements. First of all, it's not our place to make those statements. The resistance factions themselves are not making those statements. So I would just urge caution on that. It's definitely a major disruption. There's no doubt.
And I want to, sorry, Helena, just allow me for a second. I think this is important. The resistance didn't depend, nothing depends on the presence of any particular leader like Bashar al-Assad or anything else. But what is important is a sovereign Syria. And nobody who supports Palestinian liberation, Asa and I say this in our article, should have anything to fear from a sovereign Syria, a Syria that is independent and sovereign and in control of itself, because we have no doubt in where the compass of the Syrian people lies. But what is being created here is a non-sovereign Syria, a Syria that has been completely robbed of its sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence. Syria is being carved up. Israel has grabbed land.
Like this, as it stands, the state is gone.
The state has been failed. It has been failed and collapsed, not just by what happened in the last days, but by decades of sanctions aimed at hollowing the state out and forcing a collapse and really making any type of reform impossible, because then, when it's sort of in this survival mode. So no one has anything to fear from a sovereign Syria. The question is, will Syria be sovereign?
Yeah.
Of course, it's undoubtedly the case that many Syrians are overjoyed, and we saw Syrians coming out into the streets. Some of them were overjoyed. We saw prisoners being released and being reunited with their families. But what we're not seeing is the Syrians who aren't overjoyed, because they're not going to come out into the streets and say we're not overjoyed. Those are people who are going to be staying at home, living in fear, as many are in many parts of Syria, and they're Syrian too. And they have good reason to be afraid, given the record of these groups, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the various alphabet soup of ISIS-related and Al-Qaeda-related groups that have now taken over. And Asa and I pointed this out in our article, which you don't really have to look very far back to see what's going on, because remember that this group was running Idlib, this enclave on the border with Syria, for the last couple of years. And Human Rights Watch, which, you know, is not always a group I put stock in, but I think we can take Human Rights Watch seriously here, because Human Rights Watch has always been sympathetic to Western government policy, and its longtime director, Kenneth Roth, ex-director now, but he was director during much of the Syria war, is a strong proponent of regime change. And so the Human Rights Watch documented many of the abuses in Idlib under the rule of Jolani and HTS, including arbitrary imprisonment, torture, horrifying abuses, and we haven't seen those prisons being opened up. And in March of this year, there were widespread protests across Idlib. This was reported by Voice of America, by Deutsche Welle, by all Western media across Idlib governorate against HTS and its abuses. And those protests broke out again in May against people, against HTS in Idlib, by people complaining that HTS was very abusive, including torturing people to death in its prisons. And the reason I say that is because we're being told all the time, well, aren't you happy to see people being released from prisons? Of course I'm happy to see political prisoners being released, no matter who is holding them. It's absolutely horrifying that anyone should have been held, and nobody is pretending or should pretend that the government of Bashar al-Assad or his father was, the government of Finland or any other sort of supposedly ideal liberal state. But the whitewashing the people who have been backed by the United States and Turkey and tacitly by Israel over the 13 years of the civil war, that's propaganda. That's not analysis. And what we aim to do here is analysis, to understand the reality, so that we're not taken by surprise by events. You've got to understand who these people are. Yeah. That's who they are. And to date, you can go to the FBI website, and the bounty of $10 million for al-Jolani is still there for anyone who can help the United States government to locate him. Well, apparently they know where he is now. Maybe they'll collect the $10 million themselves.
Yeah.
And even supposing that HTS, run by Jolani, who is the former emissary of al-Baghdadi, the head of ISIS. So remember, Jolani was a member of ISIS, and then he founded the Al-Qaeda branch in Syria. And now he's had this Western media makeover where he's now called the diversity-friendly jihadi, literally by the Telegraph. I don't know, maybe Asa, you can even pull that headline up and we can look at it in a minute.
I'll find it.
Suppose that HTS has been completely reformed, as people say, and it's now, being run along diversity, equity, and inclusion lines. The problem is that in the chaos of Syria, the collapse of the state, all these other groups, and I've seen these videos too, we're not going to show any, of the people in ISIS patches, with ISIS patches and this sort of thing, going around murdering people and harassing them. They're not under anyone's control. That's what, when you have a failed state, nobody is in control. And that's why so many people are utterly terrified, and that has to be acknowledged too. I would be, you can think of all sorts of governments that are less than ideal, and yet there's still an element where a lot of people are going to feel unsafe when the state as itself collapses.
Yeah, I think this has been a huge story, actually, since the US invasion of Afghanistan, and then the invasion of Iraq, and then the so-called humanitarian mission in Libya. I mean, this is what happens when they deliberately destroy the structure of a state, the defensive structure of a state. So, you know, the Israelis and the Americans between them over the last 13 years have been working on doing this to Syria. And in the past 48 hours, their militaries have been, you know, just systematically demolishing all the defensive capabilities of the Syrian state. So yes, we have a failed state with massive Turkish incursion in the north, massive Israeli incursion in the south, and the American presence over there in the east. So people have a mix of emotions, and we don't need to get too like bound up with the emotionalism, but obviously when prisoners get released from a jail, when people who have been deported get to go back to their homes, that is wonderful. That is wonderful for Syria's people. Let's think about the many Lebanese and Palestinians who would love to see those things happen for themselves. To
And
have,
this, what about this? And the Syrians in the, you know, in the
yeah,
jails in Idlib.
Idlib. Yeah, thank you.
And the millions of Syrians displaced by this 13-year war that was funded to the tune of billions of dollars by the United States, by Turkey, by Qatar, by Saudi Arabia, the sanctions that immiserated people, millions of refugees left Syria, many went to Europe. And now you have these European countries that also funded the proxy war and the dirty war in Syria, immediately saying, oh, we're sending you all back. And where are they? You know, Austria announced that it's going to begin deportations of Syrians. Germany announced that it's going to stop processing asylum applications from Syrians, and other of these human rights loving EU states are announcing the same. To send them back to where? To send them back to a country that is in total collapse, that is being bombed, whose economy has been totally destroyed by sanctions, where there are uncontrolled sectarian gangs running around murdering people already, even within days of the state's collapse, and you're going to send all these people back there. There was Libya. Still nobody talks about Libya now in the Western media. All the people who are championing the regime change war in Libya, the NATO bombing and the murder of Libya's leader, which Hillary Clinton applauded and laughed about and cackled about and thought was just a wonderful thing. There's a UN report published in August, we linked to it in the article that Ace and I wrote, about the utter chaos, the disaster in Libya today. It's on the edge of civil war. No one cares about it. No one talks about it. And all those people who are talking about, oh, we're going to bomb Libya into a democracy, all those people have moved on. They don't talk about Libya now.
You know, I think it's also important to focus the effects of all these events on the Palestinian rights movement globally, because the re-emergence of intense sectarianism within Syria and those kind of sectarian comments that Ahmed Sha'ir, Jolani, whatever his name is, his very sectarian comments, and the fact that we have this kind of re-emergence of sectarianism in the global discussion, not just about Syria, but potentially this could harm again the Palestinian rights movement. I mean, we know that the discussions, the divisions over Syria were very harmful within the Palestinian rights movement here in the United States right until October 7th of 2023. And then on October the 7th, 2023, we had the big Hamas-led breakout from Gaza, which sparked a huge amount of support all around the world, including in this country, but it also sparked very, very solid solidarity actions of a military nature from Hezbollah and from Ansar Allah in Yemen, the Houthis, which are overwhelmingly Shiite movements. Hamas and most Palestinian Muslims being Sunnis. So suddenly that whole narrative of, a sectarian divide throughout the region, and that Sunnis and Shiites are fundamentally at odds with each other, and we Westerners need to just stand aside and let them kill each other, while actually fomenting the sectarianism as much as we can, as white people do through colonies, empires throughout history. That whole narrative of sectarian divide collapsed on October 7th and October 8th of 2023.
Yeah.
And people stopped talking about it.
And we've said it before here that the United States has weaponized sectarianism. They did it in Iraq. They did it after Israel's 2006 defeat in Lebanon, when Hezbollah's stock across the region was very high and support for the resistance was very high. So you had this massive propaganda campaign after 2006 in Saudi-funded media across the region to try to rebrand Hezbollah as a sectarian Shia extension of Iran instead of an Arab, Muslim, Arab
Deeply
nationalist resistance
indigenously
movement.
Lebanese.
Indigenously Lebanese. And that has penetrated so many people's minds. And it was, I thought that one of the good things of the, there's nothing, very little that can be said that's good about the last 14 months. But I thought one of the silver linings was that sectarianism had been put to bed, and people had started to understand that the fate of the region is one, and that if people are disunited and allow themselves to be divided and ruled, then the United States and Israel, the road is open to them to do what they want. And it's just tragic to me how quickly that sectarianism was reawakened in so many people and weaponized in the most disgusting and revolting ways. And there's no United Nations now. I mean, at the time, the 1974 disengagement agreement, as it was called, between Syria and Israel was negotiated. This is a very solemn, serious thing, and it's enacted by the Security Council. And when Netanyahu just announces unilaterally, it's done, it's over, and sends his troops and his tanks into it, if things functioned the way they were supposed to, the UN Security Council should meet immediately to discuss this gross violation and act to remedy this gross violation of a disengagement and a demilitarized zone, which is enforced by a UN Security Council. And yet there's nothing, there's barely condemnation. In fact, the United States, the statement I saw, basically said that Israel's bombardment of Syria, that's a matter for Israel. So there is no United Nations anymore. Antonio Guterres, the head of the Secretary General, speaks as if he's a State Department spokesperson, basically. There is no independent United Nations authority anymore, if there ever was. There is no Arab League. It's nothing. It exists on paper. No one is waiting for what it has to say. No one cares if it meets or not. So it's not just that the states have collapsed, but any sort of international system, for better or worse, has collapsed. And we live in a very dangerous time, because it's not just, we focus, of course, on what's happening in Palestine and in Syria and in Lebanon, but the risk of nuclear war with Russia is increasing because of reckless policies that are aimed at maintaining the hegemony and power of the United States empire. And these things are linked. This, it's not, Russia and Ukraine is not a main topic of our program ever. There are very good programs out there where you can watch those, and we're never going to be as expert as them. But there are also people in Washington who see what's happening in Syria as part of their war on Russia, because of Russia's bases in Syria, because of Russia's presence in Syria. And so what implications does that have? That certainly intensifies Russia's incentives to win the war in Ukraine. So contrary to what some people think, this won't be good for Ukraine from from their perspective, because Russia now absolutely cannot afford to fail in Ukraine. Other Arab regimes are going to look at this and not say, oh, we need to, and not just Arab regimes and others, and not say, oh, we need to become wonderful democracies. They're going to say we need to crack down more because otherwise we might be regime changed. So there are going to be repercussions of this that we're going to see for years to come, all sorts of different types of blowback that we can't even contemplate yet.
And we kind of touched on this a little earlier, but I think it would be worth reiterating and expanding on, because it is really fascinating how in the U.S., even among like self-proclaimed allies of the Palestinian cause, right, that there's a vast misunderstanding of the implications of Zionist colonialism in occupied Palestine, right? For one, it is often treated as a single issue. And I'm always like, how can it be a single issue when Israel's presence in the region has like a deadly impact on numerous nations, right? And I want to be clear that even if Israel, as an imperialist outpost for the U.S., only impacted Palestinians, that would be enough to light the world on fire, right? In my opinion. But it is not just Palestinians who are vulnerable to the deadly assaults of the Zionist regime, but the entire region is, right? And you make this clear in your piece when you write, and I'm quoting here, as clear as it was in the 20th century, the fight is not simply about or within Gaza. Rather, it is felt across all Arab capitals, from Cairo to Amman to Damascus to Baghdad. And it is a cause for the mass of the region to organize around. The struggle for Palestine is a struggle for the future of the Arab region. The people of the region were aware of this in the 20th century, and they remain aware of it now, despite decades-long efforts to enforce a top-down normalization, end quote. So just talk about this a bit, the kind of multinational reverberations of the Palestinian struggle, and maybe say a word about what it would even look like to organize under such a rubric, right? Such a pan-Arabism, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so, as we're seeing now, like Israel is proving to be a chimera of death and destruction in the region. Like only yesterday, Israel was bombing Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, obviously while conducting its operations and continuing its genocide in Gaza.
Absolutely.
Yeah, even there's like talks of a ground invasion in Lebanon now as well. But if we take a bird's eye view and like zoom out a little bit and think about the last, 15, 20 years in the region, if Iraq was dismantled and destroyed, Syria, like there was a civil war, Libya invaded and destroyed, Egypt neutralized and under, dire economic situations. So all of the countries surrounding Palestine and the Zionist state have effectively been destroyed or like destroyed by imperialism in one way or another. So any like manifestation or instance of Arab sovereignty is seen as a threat to imperialism. Be it like I'm not even talking about whether it's a socialist or leftist project or not, just any expression of sovereignty. Like I don't purport to support Saddam Hussein, but he wanted a sovereign Iraq in his own way, and that project had to be dismantled, and the US intervened directly in that. Libya, the same thing, like NATO and the US intervened to destroy Libya as it existed. Some people might say that Libya had its problems, but it was a sovereign state and it was destroyed. But for the US, that's a success story because, oil is not nationalized anymore and can be extracted. The same can be said for Syria. The same can be said in a different way for Egypt, like the biggest existential threat to Israel, historical existential threat to Israel on its borders, the biggest Arab army, neutralized in that way and having its sovereignty taken away from it. And obviously that is through, like imperialism does so, and through either leveraging debt or sanctions. In the case of Egypt and Jordan, it's, controlled by either US aid, or in the case of Egypt, international financial institutions and structural adjustment programs of the IMF and the World Bank that keep it indebted and keep its economy subservient to the world economy and, make it less reliant on its own products. And it doesn't even, it's an import-based economy now. And that erodes the sovereignty. And that's why, for example, Sisi refused or like did not, lift the siege on Gaza or like did not allow delegations to go through, because the more you're subservient on the US economically, the more you're going to follow US orders. And that is not like, that is the materialist analysis here at play. Like, it's not because, you know, Sisi hates Palestinians, or it's just because it's his regime's legitimacy is reliant on international financial institutions in the US. And that's how imperialism controls the region. And on the other side, countries like Iran are subject to sanctions, and that cripples it in a way, but it also frees it to be openly antagonistic towards the US because it's against its own national interests. So if maybe you can look at the region and say, if Israel didn't exist, US imperialism would have found a way to wreak havoc on it anyway. But, you know, in order for us to see if the region is going to prosper or not, then we have to defeat US imperialism. And by default, its proxy, which is the Zionist entity.
Absolutely. I appreciate that.
And of course, sorry, the second part of the question, which is, you say, like, what would that look like? We saw an iteration of pan-Arabism under Nasser. And, you know, pan-Arabism existed before Nasser as an idea, but he popularized it and took on the figure of pan-Arabism. And that project was, you know, with all its faults, it was defeated severely in 1967, which was considered like a monumental loss that not only was it the biggest defeat of the Arab armies against Israel, but it also solidified how useful Israel was to the US, in that it was able to defeat Arab radical projects such as, you know, Arab socialism as tied to pan-Arabism, communism, Arab nationalism, because these projects were tied to the huge military defeat. So then, as the US was busy conducting the Vietnam War, the Zionist entity was able to do its work for it and in the Cold War and defeat third worldism and, you know, Arab socialism and Arab nationalism.
This is the core of the problem. And Jan, you already laid it out in the beginning, but in the way that international relations in the West, the global North, is conceptualized, the need for an enemy is always there, right? Just as with deterrence, just as deterrence always expects that there's something to be deterred, the idea NATO itself needs Russia, it needs China, the significant other. Can the Europeans, can the global North overcome this? Or what should the thinking part of the world, the not dumb part of the world, do in order to deal with this obsession with creating their own enemies to justify their existence? Sorry, Jan, and then
that's a nice little one.
It's the easy question.
Let me first say
well
the
put.
deterrence theory is based on the idea that somebody is, at least potentially, or perhaps de facto, an enemy. Secondly, I believe that when you see yourself as number one, you don't learn, you teach. If you're number 10 in a system, you have 9 others to learn from. How did they climb and do things better than I did? And that's, of course, what the Western world now is facing. We have not learned anything in the last many decades, and others are learning fast and doing things differently from us. And I think there's one thing perhaps we should touch upon, and I'm no expert on it, but I think this idea of enemies is a little bit related to the idea of Christian missionary thinking. They have to be like us. Unity in uniformity. Open up China in the 70s, then it will become like us. And that is a terrible mistake. The only unity that is interesting is unity in diversity and difference. So this trying to make others be like us is a very Western thing that, if you will, the Chinese don't have. The Chinese and the Japanese, by the way, where you sit, Pascal, are very happy of being special. They don't want everybody else to be like them. And they don't sell their social system or their ways of thinking. You know, China is not trying to make people Confucianists or Buddhists or anything like that, or one-party states all over the place. But we have this, I would call it a disease, that we think that we are so great that whatever we do in the West, it should be universalized. and the others should be like us. You know, that was also built into the idea of the first world, second world, third world, and fourth world, that they would go up, you know, trickle down some values and economies and trickle up ways of thinking so that they would be like us. And that, of course, this idea of universalizing, I've always been against from a peace point of view, even if it was Gandhian thinking would be the only one, if anything, that could be universalized because it doesn't hurt anybody else. But when you have this mission idea that somebody must be like us, and if they don't do it with the Bible, then we do it with a sword, is a way of creating enemies. And we're back to one thing that is very clear. And I noticed that as a young student in the 70s, there was a brilliant German scholar whose name was Dieter Senghas, who wrote an idea, a thick book in German about structural militarism. And one of his points were, if the Soviet Union falls into the sea tomorrow, the West will very quickly readapt, find some other enemy, and continue armament, because it cannot live without enemies. And that's, you know, one of the things I have, as a young student, took into my thinking, that all these arguments that Russia is a big threat, that China is a big threat, that God knows who is a big threat, are inventions. It's kind of a necessary paranoia. It's something where you can say there's no rational analysis behind it. I mean, I'm 73. All the years I've been living, I've heard that the Russians are coming. I mean, you cannot even trust these damn Russians. They're not coming. They're supposed to come. They don't come, right? So they have never invaded a neutral country, and they have never invaded or tried to invade a NATO country. But still, you can make NATO expansion, and you can get enemies, and you can then persuade Sweden and Finland to join. And then also, by the way, as probably some of you know, there's now 47, within 1 year, 47 new bilaterally decided American bases in Scandinavia. Now, this is a disease because the Russians have no designs on invading Scandinavia. But you can hear Swedish top brass say we must prepare for Putin landing on the shores of southern Sweden and making a partial occupation of Sweden. You know, I said, what bullshit is that? Because I live here. But long story short, this cultivation of those others, the evil forces and the good forces, we being the good. I mean, this is so deep into Western cosmology, ways of thinking, that I think people who just work, you know, like peace movements, just focus basically on weapons, will not achieve anything, because weapons are a production of a certain way of thinking. I'm very much into ideas that should change, rather than just looking at a weapon system and say that must go or stop that war. It comes from some way of thinking. And I've tried to say some of them. Finally, let me just say, I'm not quite sure that the deterrence thinking is just a smokescreen for what you said. It is also a smokescreen. But I think if you talk with people in uniform, they are bent on, they have never been thinking of security as anything else but deterrence. That's what they teach at military academies. It's a way of practicing a profession, if you will. If somebody say, hey, why do we need to deter somebody else? They're not our enemies. They would not fit into that system. But it serves dominance and unipolar global dominance, or what is it called, full spectrum dominance and all that. I agree with that, but I don't think it's only a substitute. I don't think it's an invention to legitimate colonialism or dominance. I think it's a way people think in the profession of the military. And I'm very happy to say that in the 80s, I wrote a book with a lieutenant colonel in Germany, Wilhelm Nolte, and a Swiss peace researcher, Dietrich Fischer. And we went through all these things, and the book was called Winning Peace, and why we needed to think radically different about what defense and security and peace is, and why we need to have a global ethics. Because we only have a neighborhood ethics. You're not allowed to kill, and you should not look at your neighbor's beautiful wife and things like that. We need a global ethics, because what we do today has global consequences. And that's a whole different discussion. But we need a global and not a local ethical attitude, because everything we do has vibrate through the global system. And that's why these global reach weapons should go, and we should think it differently, because we have a right to self-defense, but we don't have a right to kill others far away. That's Article 1 of the UN Charter.
Agogo, feel free to react.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Thanks very much, Jan. I'm thinking of where to get a handle on this. Yeah, maybe let me start with your response. I do see your point in saying this is perhaps not necessarily entirely a smoke screen. But I'll tell you, maybe let me try and explain that a bit more. So I agree with you in principle that it could be that I think what I suggest is one way of thinking about it. I cannot presume that it will be the only way of thinking about it. But if we take what happened 2 days ago, for instance, and Pascal was reviewing Brian's brilliant summary of what's happening in Syria. And you did that video last night, Pascal, isn't it? And at the exact same time, perhaps even now as we speak, at the exact same time that the CNN is granting an interview to this guy, that Al Jazeera, CNN, and all the major Western corporate medias are calling these guys opposition and rebels, that as that organization appears on the US list of terrorists. As of when Pascal was doing it last night, it was still there. So this is why I don't think this is why I think there is some contrivance here. I mean, these guys, it's to reduce the cognitive ability of many of the Western thinkers to assume that they are really making a mistake about this.
Mm-hmm.
And when I also say it's a smokescreen, it's not necessarily all of the West, because of course we never talk of all of the West, we never talk of all of Africa anyway. I'm looking particularly at the Western establishment, the Western political establishment. I don't think they don't know. It's what I think. I think we would be insulting them and promoting ourselves to a higher level of rationality if we think they really don't know. It's what I'm thinking now. Because there is a way, if we study, as we decolonial scholars tend to do, the colonial episteme, which is at the heart of what we call thinking that is colonial. That episteme, in my view, needs to be challenged. And I don't think Europeans have challenged that episteme yet, or sufficiently. So for instance, decolonial work is focused right now on, as an African scholar, we are trying to speak to Africans to unshackle their thinking, to stop thinking that they are inferior, to have self-reliant epistemological ideas and processes, to unshackle themselves from tutelage to the West. But I think the West needs to do this. I think they absolutely need to do this themselves in order to create the self-awareness that is required, especially not among the members of the establishment, but among the general populace and among more ordinary people like us who would be able, because I've been asked one question by somebody in my household. When I make these arguments that, but Westerners don't want these wars. Now that person has asked me then, why don't they prevail on their governments? They're supposed to have democracy. And Jan, you said something similar in your last discussion. You said something, not those exact words. How is it that European populations are sleepwalking into a civil war? It is among that population, I think, that confusion prevails. So my proposition, I hope this is a bit coherent. I've got too many things I wanted to talk about. My suggestion is that some decolonial work, some reconsideration of the episteme, the core of dominant Western ideology, be done in a very systematic, a very patient way to get people to think. Yes, there are those people in the West who will say that's the problem. We feel under threat from Russia. We feel under threat from these people. That is why we want to act like that. There's one more point I wanted to make about this. I think it was it John was talking about, or was it Yan was talking about the American responses to China. So take, for instance, build back better. Does anybody remember that? That was a slogan that Biden when he became president. It was so shamelessly an attempt to respond to the BRI. It was such a caricature. I remember sitting and watching Rex Tillerson, who was Donald Trump's minister, in visiting Nigeria and looking very scared, speaking to the Nigerian president. Y'all must stop taking loans from China. I said, does this guy even understand that he's making a fool of himself? Because it's so clear that there is a fear of China in terms, not a fear of physical attack, but a fear that China is getting better than them. So I hope this is a bit coherent. I had too many things in mind. Yes, I think the last thing I want to say that's important, and that might respond to Jan's point about why this is not necessarily a philosophical smokescreen. Right. Do we consider the material aspects? Because I find this, and again, I might not be very correct. I don't make myself an expert. I do not presume that I'm expert of European epistemologies, but we're all brought up in European ideas. I'm now 53. So if I'm constituted of a lot of these ideas, you would understand. European philosophy often presents himself as immaterial. When I see people conducting European analysis, exegesis, when they speak of the material, it's often in regard to the non-European subject. So let's look at the epistemology of war and deterrence. So there is a philosophical idea that we need to be protected. There's the creation of the enemy, right? Have we considered the material dollars and cents aspect of military production? Because this clearly serves the interest of the establishment. Somebody is getting tenders and getting contracts. Somebody gets a contract to start a war. They get a contract to rebuild after they destroy the place in the war. They get another contract to start another war. They get another contract to rebuild. They get a contract to deplete all the inventories in Ukraine. They are going to get another contract to replenish the inventories. And I find it difficult to believe that those guys who get those contracts do not know that they have to fool people. In one of Jeffrey Sachs' presentations not too long ago, it's when I heard that prior to the invasion of Iraq, the notorious invasion of Iraq, focus groups were conducted to find a way of selling the war as a justified expense and activity by the West. People who would go out and do a focus group, who would select terms carefully, cannot not know. Those they are fooling may not know, but they who do the fooling, it is my considered opinion that to a large extent, they do know what they are saying. Maybe let me stop here.
Thank you for that. And John, please, the same open, feel free to react.
I wanted to bring the issue, back to the question of world order now. And it's no longer abstract, right? And I spoke about this, the rise of the rest. This is really obvious and this is unstoppable. But the vanguard of this rise is clearly China. It's China that's causing the West to lose its mind. Okay. And really one has to grasp the scale of the phenomenon of Chinese development over the last few decades. The world has never seen anything like this. There's never been anything like this in economic history. Just the number of people urbanized, raised from poverty, the GDP increase, the industrialization. In fact, actually on a scale that dwarfs the Western Industrial Revolution. None of this is reflected in Western social science. It hasn't caught up with it. You have a social scientific apparatus, speaking of the episteme, that is built on European experience and European assumptions and on a European data set. It hasn't taken this into account, and psychologically, there's a great difficulty taking into account. But let's get really concrete about the problem we have right now. So you have this phenomenon. You have a world order coming to be. We're in this famous interregnum, this Gramscian interregnum. But what China has set out, for example, is something utterly concrete. It doesn't, it's not kumbaya and airy-fairy. In fact, what's airy-fairy, what lacks specification, what's utterly idealized and abstract, is the existing conception, the Western conception of world order based on deterrence. You have these states that are all black boxes, and then they exist in this sort of balance ultimately of terror, of fear. But the Chinese one, that's why these initiatives such as the Development Initiative and the Security Initiative are side by side with this civilizational initiative. Because this civilizational stuff, again, it sounds like, oh, wow, pretty airy-fairy. It isn't. This is what we've been doing right here. This is what you've organized, Pascal. Civilizational dialogue. We're going to need more and more of this. We need voices from the rest of the world to come up. And there's a huge intellectual task, but it's also a social one. We need to start talking to one another. And I think civilization is a good frame because it stands back and it includes history. It includes these cosmologies. Those are the things that are left out of the types of discussion that you have, that you and I are accustomed to in, say, a Western seminar, where all the assumptions are frankly liberal assumptions. Those don't work anymore. And they certainly don't work for the rest of us. Someone like myself, a go-go, whatever, we go into this and we are used to dropping all the rest of that cosmology that we've been talking about. And I appreciate that we're talking about that. We drop the history. We pretend we don't have these things. We have this, like Du Bois said, this kind of double consciousness. It's time to let go of that, right? So look, the Chinese one is about constructing peace, about peace not merely as the absence of war. Right. So it cannot be just the peace as a result of a deterrence based on fear. That isn't peace in the Chinese conception. So peace as something you construct, as an active thing, a set of relationships, harmony between people, that needs work. And the work that's going into it, I mean, is what's proposed. Whether you can agree or disagree with it, but there's a development initiative, which is about, ultimately, the Chinese view is, look, we realize that our growth is a big thing, and that in the middle of this, we need to balance our security concerns with global security. That is, of course, peace. The rise of China is disruptive on existing powers, existing orders, or existing order, that it looks frightening from the West. But this needs to be, or it might worry the neighbors. But this needs to be this rise needs to be balanced with some kind of proposition for the rest of the world. So it's this kind of balance between one's own security and the security of the global community, and the refusal to think of these as two separate things, which is a very common practice in the West. Just this isolation, this idea of international relations as a separate field where barbarism can and barbaric considerations can reign, right? So there is that. I think that balance is very important, and from here on we have to start thinking like this. This addresses the great question Pascal set out at the beginning. How is it that you can think of that you must have an enemy to think of your own security? Actually, this is a very unnatural way of thinking for many people around the world. I mean, to this day, China does not talk about the US as the enemy. You don't hear that. It isn't. China does not have enemies. ASEAN does not have enemies. You have countries that have, behavior that you might not agree with at a particular time, but until the shooting starts, it's not the enemy. That blanket way of there's just no need in their worldview and in their way of discussing things to think of it like that. But I want to look at the concrete efforts, the development initiative, this massive BRI effort, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative. These all go towards constructing a community, a global community capable of peace.
Everything became destabilized, and the sanctions in that effect, they really worked on Syria.
Yeah, and so we should definitely talk about that, and just for the audience, one of the ways that the U.S. is able to power project and carry out its political will is A, through military intervention, either direct or through proxies, and B, through economic sanctions, economic warfare, essentially starving out a country in terms of money, trade, outside investment, import, export, make the life of the average person so unbearable that they revolt against the government that the U.S. does not like. We tried it with Russia. If you guys recall, during the outset of the invasion of Ukraine, The Economist and all these like legacy media outlets in the West were saying, life for people is untenable with these sanctions. There's going to be a palace coup. Putin will be overthrown. There'll be a popular revolution. Been trying to do this maximum pressure campaign of economic sanctions against Iran in order to help facilitate a regime change. Hasn't happened. But as Robert was saying, yes, it definitely did work here in Syria, we could say.
Yeah, absolutely. And that really contributed. And at the end, you can see these videos of CNN going into, the presidential palace or looking at Assad's car collection. I don't know the ins and outs of that, but for sure, those senior officials and Bashar himself were not personally suffering like the people were from the sanctions. It's just not what happens. The people suffer, like happened in Iraq. It's the same thing. People, 90% of Syrians, it was estimated, were below the poverty line. So that's how the Syrian people were living. In fact, Syrians who were in Idlib, which was deeply deprived at many points of all resources, people in Idlib were living better than people under the control of government areas in many cases. People were just incredibly poor. And this includes everyone. This includes the Sunni majority, and it includes all the minority communities as well. So the pressure was immense. And a lot of people who were fighting on the side of the government, who believed in the government. So for instance, you have like a lot of, and it's not all Christians believe one thing, all Sunni believe one thing or whatever. The majority of the Syrian Arab army, its fighters anyway, their conscripts were Sunni because the majority of the population is Sunni. It makes sense, right? I'm not saying anything about leadership or whatever. I'm just saying about the actual army itself. Those people who fought and died for that vision of Syria under Bashar as the leader believed that Syria was going to return to what Syria was before 2011, that things were just going to be restored to normal, and that their country would be free of foreign interference. And that's what they genuinely had in their minds. In 2018, the fighting stopped completely. They signed the Astana Accords, the Syrian government with the Turkish government and the Iranians and the Russians. All the fighting stopped. Nothing got better. Everything got worse. And in the end, for somebody to want to pick up a weapon and fight for what cause at the end of the day. And obviously that's not exactly what happened in this case. Like the fall of Aleppo, for instance, was because generals called their troops back. They were told to withdraw. There was no fighting. In fact, there was no fighting inside of Aleppo. No real fighting inside of Aleppo. There was no fighting inside of Hama or in Homs or in Damascus. There was fighting in the countrysides, but there was no actual fighting inside. They gave it up and they withdrew. So there was obviously something else going on in the background. There were agreements which were struck, evidently. Accusations one way or another, which I won't get into now. And this sort of gets into sources and what they tell you. But, ultimately the people in Syria were suffering greatly. The situation has now dramatically changed. That may change eventually for the betterment of the living standards of the people of Syria. It may allow for instance, the resistance to continue in a similar way that it has, over, let's say, the past few decades with Iran's construction of this axis of resistance. Or it may take a different form now. It may be new groups emerging. It may be that Hamas plays a greater role, for instance, in Syria, or it could not be. So there are many possibilities on the table. I think at the moment, as much as possible to encourage that, the best possible process there, just for the sake of the people. The last thing we want to see is sectarian violence, and this head to the direction of further civil war, where it's just everyone is fighting everyone and taking whatever backing they can, because that would be ultimately catastrophic. So it's a very difficult situation to read right now. There's so many different foreign powers vying for their interests, and it's sort of a free-for-all at the moment. So what we're seeing currently is that this could go in a different direction. There could be new relations made. There are groups in Syria, for instance, that are open to, right now, and they really do want to commit themselves to the Palestinian resistance. But will that be allowed to happen? What is going to happen? What sort of people are we going to see implementing the laws? Will Syrian society coexist? Syrians are, not a sectarian people by nature. If you look at them before, very, very united. The idea of people asking each other what their faith background is on the street is something that just wasn't the case. Syrians in general are not like that. So there is a possibility that the Syrian people will come together and forge a new future. But there are so many foreign influences that competing ideologies, which could make this very difficult and could take this down a very negative direction, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's kind of why I wanted to bring up earlier in this episode the SDF fighting the Syrian National Army. So Syrian National Army, demonstrably Turkish-backed, Kurds, backed overwhelmingly by the United States, armed, funded. We've sent them training advisors like Green Berets, special forces groups, to help train them to fight the Islamic State and other elements in the region that we don't like. And they're fighting each other. Two NATO-backed states fighting each other. And I think from the outsider who doesn't really have any experience with Syria or a strong knowledge base, I think that's just a really good situation to highlight when it comes to talking about this, because those are just two of the big ones. Okay, you got the SDF, the Kurds, Syrian National Army, HTS, and a hundred other groups as well. And again, as you brought in the Arab tribal powers and forces within the region, which aren't necessarily declared for anything yet, taking like a wait and see approach. But I did want to focus more on we already kind of touched on this, how HTS really politically cannot afford to challenge Israel right now. And even if they did, what would that accomplish? The narrative that I'm seeing going around in a lot of our spaces is they're Al-Qaeda. The CIA runs Al-Qaeda. That's why they'll never attack Israel. And that's kind of infantile and a juvenile analysis of the whole thing. So I would say. I'd say there's an element, like if you look at the rank and file of HTS, there's an enormous amount of people that have that Al-Qaeda ideology. Yeah. But then if you look at, for instance, those who are in its leadership, there's the difference. And there are people that are able to, they're politically savvy, I don't believe Abu Muhammad al-Julani is stuck to one ideology specifically, so hardline. He skips in between groups, he's able to splinter certain groups and break off into others. Obviously take foreign backing at some point. Nusra, which is HTS, it's just a rebrand essentially, led by the same people, was taking backing, and its fighters were being treated by the Israelis at one point. But at the same time, you've got many people inside of HTS that would say we were going to liberate Palestine, and today is Damascus, and tomorrow is Jerusalem. Yeah, and so I think some of the most telling videos from the street, I think it was when they first took Aleppo, there was a video of an HTS guy taking down a Christmas tree and overturning it, and there was other members in a later video putting the Christmas tree back up from the same group. So yeah, it's kind of hard to characterize. That just highlights the divisions which are inherent in this organization. And it doesn't want to appear a certain way, but certain members will carry out acts
lawlessly.
Field executions.
Field executions will occur. And not all these field executions are committed by HTS. They're committed by the myriad of other groups as well. That are operating there. Even when HTS came into Aleppo, they had an instant clash with Jaish al-Islam, and they were shooting each other in the streets. I mean, more people essentially died inside of Aleppo between the opposition groups than fighting the Syrian army. There were clashes that started immediately. These groups, there are so many of them. Some of them are just hardline, Al-Qaeda ideology. That's how they are. There are smaller groups that just think like that, and they are not in any way secular. They don't care about a Syrian state, Syrian sovereignty, even the idea of a Syrian state to them. What is that? What is a Syrian state? That doesn't make sense. We're not for a national flag. We're for what they would call an Islamic state, right, or a caliphate, in their vision and their view of Islam. Rather warped view, I might add. But there are groups like that, and then there are people like that in HTS. Then in HTS, you do have people that belong to HTS who are sort of like mercenaries. They'll do exactly what they're told. So it's a complex picture inside that organization. I do believe if it's pressured in the right ways, there is a prospect for something working and there to be some sort of settlement. Will there be issues? Absolutely. But can Syria emerge from this better and start clearing out some of these more extremist elements and factions? It is also possible. I don't think we have to be completely doom and gloom about the situation. But
that is the overwhelming analysis that's being given right now, though. We have to recognize that.
At the same time, it's something that it could head in that direction. So there has to be people have to be, I believe, cautious when analyzing it, because right now we are in a transitional phase. And we don't know exactly where it is going to go. And there are a myriad of very extreme groups and individuals, which will make this very difficult. And the thing is, on the Israeli question and about HTS fighting Israel and combating Israel, the problem that they could face is if they don't fight Israel. And I can imagine that Israel might eventually decide, if they think it's safe to do so, to go to some suburb or go to some place near Damascus where you can see Damascus, the city, in the background, and put an Israeli flag up for a photo, because that's just how they operate. They like to do things like this. But there could be a loss of legitimacy there. The majority of Syrians who are backing the opposition side, ultimately, everyone on each side of this conflict, despite the polar opposite views and what they think of each other, ultimately mostly want the same thing. The Syrian people, they want the same thing. They do all believe that their country, they want a stable country, they want a safe country for all. They want a democratic country, many of them. They have different iterations of that, but they want to be opposed, for instance, to Israel. The vast majority of Syrians are not pro-Israeli, they're pro-Palestinian. And you see that amongst all Syrians, essentially. You'd be hard-stretched to find Syrians who will say, I'm pro-Israeli, other than some people who are just completely backed by the Washington think tanks or security establishment. And so, again, HTS can lose credibility if it doesn't even make statements against Israel. If it just keeps talking about how Iran is the problem, but Iran is gone, and we are here to fight Iran, but then Israel is invading more of your territory, and then Israel might use Syrian territory that it captures to attack Lebanon through the Bekaa. If that happens as well, and could you imagine if the Palestinian refugee camps inside of Lebanon are activated and start fighting the Israelis? In those refugee camps, there's many groups there which are linked to the Syrian groups which were existing before, in Idlib, for instance. So what happens when these groups are under attack, and they literally are part of the same organizations, when they're under attack, when they're fighting the Israelis? How does this work? So there are so many variables here which could change this picture dramatically. And that's why I think Israel instantly eliminated the weapons throughout Syria. It eliminated all its advanced capabilities and defensive capabilities as well, because it understood that this situation could perform a 180 out of their favor. And this could suddenly become something else. Iran does already have contacts and inroads that it can make inside Syria with a variety of different groups there. Also, the Palestinians are going to be in some way welcomed. Some, even if the US are demanding that they're out, there will be groups inside of Syria which will welcome them and will welcome Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and others into the country. That will happen. They're not going to be completely isolated in Syria. Eventually, they will be welcomed there because you won't be able to stop them from not being welcomed there. And Israel understands this. So again, right now, Israel is taking advantage of this situation. Israel is taking advantage of the fact that the United States is hanging the sanctions card over this new HTS administration, whether it lasts or not. It does not want to, jeopardize its future right now. Abu Muhammad al-Julani is vowing for power. He wants to, be the most powerful actor in Syria. He wants his party to take control, and he wants to be that man. Whether that will happen or not, I don't know. But if he starts stepping too much out of line, like you said, there could be an Israeli airstrike that comes in and takes him out. Not because necessarily they think that at some point they couldn't work with him, or that they can't communicate with him, or the United States doesn't think that they can communicate with him. Just because he's in an impossible position and he has to act and he has to do something against the Israelis, even if it's symbolic. And I think the Israelis don't even want that. They want to ensure that there's a situation in Syria, either they get an administration which normalizes with them, or complete and utter chaos. And then they use this buffer zone with their proxies to keep that chaos under wraps and keep it away from them.
No, I mean, as we were talking about, I would definitely call it controlled chaos. That is basically what the United States wouldn't be too unhappy with. The Gulf states probably want a little less chaos than the U.S. can handle. The big fear is Syria 2.0 spilling out and destabilizing the entire region. And of course, Qatar has its own vested interest in having a stable-ish Syria. Has to do with oil, other things as well. Turkey doesn't want an massively uncontrolled war zone. So the amount of pressure that's being put on the incoming HTS government is kind of impossible to resolve politically, and then the only other option is absolute chaos. The entire situation looks like it's bouncing on a knife edge.
And it's something that if someone is going to tell you 100% they know exactly where it's heading, either they're incorrect, most likely they're lying to you or they're lying to themselves, because I don't believe we know exactly where this, because there are so many converging interests inside of Syria right now. I mean, this could even spill over into Jordan. What happens if it spills over into Jordan? Yes, maybe those groups in Syria can be controlled, but will you control the groups that would emerge inside of Jordan, for instance, with a Palestinian majority population there, sharing the longest border with Israel? What would that situation bring? If you have, for instance, factions which are ready to fight the Israelis and go across, how would you control that situation? What would you do if Sisi falls and the Egyptian government is changed again? So it's very unpredictable right now, and any of these things can happen. Even in the West Bank, this could inspire change in the West Bank. We've already seen over the past week that the factions, the resistance factions in the West Bank, are now clashing directly with the Palestinian Authority. Could that be? Could this provide more inspiration to that? It could do. So again, this is a situation that's very hard to say absolutely this will happen. But there I think it's important to understand all of these different actors and how they collide. I don't think it's a situation where everyone has to be utterly depressed, because, out of these sort of situations, maybe something different can come. I don't believe the Palestinian people will ever stop resisting. Maybe the resistance will look different and it will come in different forms, but they won't stop. And if you look at the arc of history, there was a strategic defeat, you might say, but inspired further resistance afterwards, which occurred with the Arab Revolt in 1936 to 39. The Palestinians were defeated by the British and the Zionists. In 1948, that was also a defeat. 1967 was a defeat. And 1973 was a defeat. And 1982 was a big defeat. The PLO had been pushed around from everywhere. It was pushed out in 1970 from Jordan, and it set up base over in Lebanon. It was eventually forced to retreat from Lebanon. And when the PLO fled Lebanon, Israel used its right-wing fascist militias to commit massacres of thousands of innocent people in refugee camps. Later on, we saw that the resistance reemerged. Nobody could have imagined in 1982 that something called Hezbollah would rise and push the Israelis from southern Lebanon. No one could imagine that suddenly this little thing called Hamas, which before that was the Mujama al-Islamiyya, before it became Hamas in 1988 or 1987 sort of, would emerge as the most powerful actor. And then from the West Bank and Gaza, you have this Islamic resistance which comes, and all these new factions which emerge and would possess rocket capabilities, for instance. So resistance will continue. No one's going to forget. I think the entire people of the region are scarred from the horrors that we've all witnessed happen in Gaza. No one's going to lose those images from their minds. It will always scar everyone's minds, and the resistance will continue. And it doesn't matter, even if there are setbacks and differences that occur, there's always a road forward. And I believe that we don't have to view anything as this is an ultimate defeat and, throw aside the whole situation, or view it in the other way, that this is the biggest victory in the world, and then blindly just ignore all of the facts of what's happening. I saw, for instance, a lot of the coverage on the Arabi media over the weekend, where they were ignoring Israeli airstrikes, even in the Arabi media inside of Syria. And that's helping, add to this environment that we have right now, which is, polar opposites, either depressed or extremely happy. Dictator has fallen and everything's going to be great, or
the axis of resistance is done. Western imperialism has won first now, and then China's next. Yeah. I'll just say this. If you think that the U.S. is the puppet master that it is, it's been historically completely unable to control groups and actors within this part of the world. First of all. Second, one of the big victories that's happened thus far is education. People have woken up over the past year, especially in the West, to what's going on, our society, what Israel is, and our problematic involvement in the region too. So an entire generation has been alienated by what's happened over the past year. So that's another thing to consider before we get all doomy and gloomy.
How did we get here? Impunity. This is the key word to understand the barbaric scale of that the Israeli genocide has taken. Since its birth, Israel has never been held to the same standard as most of the members of the international community. Israel has defied countless General Assembly, Security Council resolutions, International Court of Justice advisory opinion, and has targeted UN personnel and facilities, and also declared personas non grata, not only me, but the Secretary General himself, without ever bearing consequences. There are never sanctions on Israel. Judicial processes are either ignored or circumvented, and trade continues, and diplomatic ties remain intact. Member states seem to be paralyzed, awestruck, many of them still normalizing the occupation, the repression of the Palestinian people, depicting their resistance in the territory that Israel occupies as terrorism, or at best as a tantrum of an unruly population incapable of abiding in silence to what the international community has decided as its faith. It is unconscionable to me that for many in the United Nations, Palestine continues to represent an issue to be negotiated, where the Palestinians have to accept sooner or later the status quo, their fight to self-determination reduced to a humanitarian crisis, and accept quietly the loss of their land, their failure to confront the imperialistic force of settler colonialism. As a human rights expert and as a human being, I have to stand against this.
Professor, you said a lot of wonderful things about China, and surely they're doing a lot of things right. But how do you reconcile the fact that to make it work for China, it seems to be based on a high level of repression, environmental destruction, censorship, a certain ideological stubbornness? I mean, we've spoken about Hong Kong, the Uyghurs. How do you reconcile that, and why do you think that's? I mean, do you think that's tolerable?
Thank you. I'm really glad you asked that question because your question captured very well the Anglo-Saxon media's perception of China. And I would suggest to you very bluntly that it's a distorted perspective of reality. Let's take the first word you use, repression. If the Communist Party of China only relied on repression to stay in power, it would not create the most dynamic economy in the world, right? It is by far the most dynamic economy in the world. It has delivered the fastest growing economy for 30 years. And it has done this by educating the Chinese people to a level and extent that the Chinese people have never been educated ever before. And you say it's repression? You obviously are taking the old Cold War mindset. I was in Moscow in 1976, and I saw repression in Moscow. And when I was in Moscow, the Soviet citizens were not allowed to travel outside the Soviet Union. That's repression. In the year 2019, 139 million Chinese left China freely. Guess what? Zero defectors. 139 million Chinese, right? That's twice the population of the UK. Went back to China. So all your description, when you say environmental degradation, China's climate change policies are far more responsible than those of the United States, which has not once, but twice withdrawn from global environmental protocols. Kyoto Protocol, the Bush administration left 8 years. Paris Accords, Trump administration left 4 years. And you know what? The reason why we're having climate change today is not because of new flows of greenhouse gas emissions from China and India. It's because of what the Western countries have put in the atmosphere since the Western Industrial Revolution. Get the data. The single largest contributor, cumulatively, right, is number 1, United States, number 2, Europe, number 3, China. Right? And the West wants China to pay an economic price for the current flows, but the West doesn't want to pay an economic price for what it put in the atmosphere. You want to deprive the Indians of electricity when the United States could just, by the way, if the United States could impose $1 a gallon tax, that would save the world. Cut down gasoline consumption, raise money for investment in green technology. Simple solutions. And by contrast, the largest reforestation program in the world is carried out by China. It has already reforested an area the size of Belgium or bigger, right? So all your descriptions capture the natural distortions of China that you get in the Anglo-Saxon media, which violate the rules of the Enlightenment, which say that you must be rational, calm, and objective, especially in understanding your adversary. And if the Chinese were as stupid and as incompetent as you describe them to be, don't worry about them. But I can assure you, you are now dealing with a far more intelligent and rational actor that doesn't fit any of the Anglo-Saxon categories that you applied to them. Please forgive my bluntness.
Now you're putting words into my mouth.
My response to that, I'm glad you mentioned Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a very typical example of how the misunderstanding arises between the West and China and the United States and China. Now, I want to go back to my point about there are 193 countries in the world. And of the countries that are concerned about Hong Kong, I guarantee you, almost no African country is interested in Hong Kong, right? I do not know of, maybe except for Japan, any other Asian country that speaks out on Hong Kong. In fact, you mentioned India. In this book, Has China Won?, I tell a story of how, I think in 1961 or 62, President John F. Kennedy of United States and Prime Minister Harold Macmillan of United Kingdom wrote a letter to the Anglophile Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, and said, hey, we understand you're going to invade Goa. Don't invade Goa, please. Let Portugal run Goa. I think within a week or two of receiving the letter, Nehru invaded Goa, took back Goa, and said Goa belongs to India, please. So in the same way as Nehru thinks that Goa belongs to India, Chinese think that Hong Kong belongs to China. And as far as I know, apart from the Western countries, in no other, out of the 193 countries in the world, take out the Western countries, the remaining countries don't say anything about Hong Kong. And also, this is another important statistic, only 12% of the world's population lives in the West. 88% lives outside the West. So in terms of your point about does China listen to opinions, I think the Chinese pay attention to the 88% figure. And I think that's what is missing in the Anglo-Saxon media, an incapacity to understand that 88%, the thinking of the 88%.
I have been a fan of Radiohead my whole life. I had my qualms with their stance on Palestine for a while. I can't hold back any longer.
Right.
Roger, after seeing what Tom York did on stage back in October, this is a year into the genocide.
Yeah.
He's going on stage for his encore of Karma Police, and a pro-Palestine demonstrator yells out something in the audience, and his reaction was so belligerent.
Come up here and say that, right here. Come on. And say what you want to say. Don't stand there like a coward. Come here and say it. Come on.
Oh, gosh.
Okay, you do. See you later.
Would you ever do something like that? And what was your response to that?
Well, I confess I wasn't surprised because, as you may or may not know, I've had run-ins. I had quite a good exchange of emails with Tom York, which it's from a few years ago when I wrote to Tom York and made the case for observing the picket line and observing the cultural boycott and not going when they were going to go a few years ago to go and play, which they did, and they went and played in Tel Aviv.
Mm-hmm.
And he sent me back a slightly snide kind of answer, trying to be funny and clever and whatever. And so I wrote a reply, but I showed it to somebody who knows it. And they said, don't send that. That'll go way over his head. And also, it'll upset him. because you're suggesting that it might be the wrong thing to do to cross the picket line, and that he's wrong and you're right about something. And there's no way. You need to put on kid gloves and blah, 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 blah. So I did. I wrote him a sort of email that went, I'm sorry if you thought I was being confrontational and blah, 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 blah. Right. And he wrote back and he said, normally people on the other side of an argument at least have the decency or the grace or the something to have a conversation. So then I wrote him back and I said, Tom, we the people in BDS would love to have been trying to have a conversation with you for months, and so have I, and we would love to have a conversation at some time. So when you say that they won't have a conversation, that they just throw shit at you from far away, that is not true. It's a porky pie, my son. People have been trying to talk to you and you will not speak to any of it. Anyway, the exchange goes on quite a long time.
Yeah.
But it
Well,
just
how did it
shows
end?
that the guy's a complete prick. And he is, obviously. But I think he's damaged. He's very damaged, you know. He's obviously very, very deeply insecure. He's obviously thinks he's very bright, but he's not. So he can't listen to the voice of it. So he can't actually have a conversation. That's why he then did an interview with Rolling Stone where he accused me and Ken Loach, the great British film director, and Brian Eno of being cowards.
For what?
I don't know. You'll have to look at the exchange.
Okay, now you have to send it to me.
It says BDS, and anybody who has anything to do with BDS is cowardly and shameful.
Oh, okay. See, this is amazing. I love when people twist and invert reality, because Johnny Greenwood, he's married to an Israeli artist.
Yeah.
Johnny Greenwood performed in Tel Aviv this year. You mentioned 2016 Radiohead performed. Johnny Greenwood issued this frankly bizarre statement back in June where he said it's unprogressive actually to support BDS, to actually urge artists to not work with each other. That's very unprogressive, Roger. And so no art is as important as stopping the death and suffering around us. How could it be? But doing nothing seems a worse option. So Roger, what does he say in solution to doing nothing? He says silencing Israeli artists for being born Jewish in Israel doesn't seem like a way to reach an understanding between the two sides of this apparently endless conflict.
Yeah, well, it's
So
bullshit, isn't it? It's complete bullshit. Obviously, there is no argument to be made. There is the oppressed and the oppressor. The oppressed are the indigenous people of Palestine. The oppressor are the settler colonial visitors from North America and North Europe. That's one thing, okay. The oppressed are murdering. The oppressors are murdering all the oppressed people so they can steal their furniture and their houses and their olive trees and their hills and their streams and their water and their land and their birthright. There is nothing difficult to understand. It is not a conflict. It is a genocide, Tom and Johnny, and you are supporting it. We must ban Israel from all international soccer at club level and international level. We must ban them from Eurovision. They should never have been in Eurovision anyway. Israel isn't in Europe. What is all that about? That's complete nonsense. But Israel must be banned. It has to be sent to Coventry. It is a rogue state, and it is a murderous, genocidal rogue state. This is nothing against Jews. I've got nothing against Judaism. I have nothing against Jewish people at all. I'm talking about the genocidal rogue state of Israel.
I mean, that's what's so particularly egregious and offensive, I think, to anyone with a brain, Roger, to be told that it's actually unprogressive to support the cultural boycott of Israel, and that we're the idiots, right? We're the cowards, because what's really progressive and brave is just acting like yeah, we could just work with Israelis and just pretend like, oh, this is just a seemingly endless conflict. Oh, they'll be fighting forever. But we should just join up, kumbaya, and let's all just hold hands and pretend like there's not an ethnic cleansing campaign. Let's pretend that Zionism is not fundamentally a genocidal ideology.
And next year, Johnny Greenwood, you and your Israeli wife can go and buy a seaside apartment in Gaza and live with the other settlers there. And good luck getting to sleep, you.
Right, so here, we don't want to become the barbarians of the Orient. We are better than them, even though we're doing the thing that we say they do. And what we need to do is sign another $180 million weapons deal with Saudi Arabia so we can sell them more precise weapons and training. And again, where have we heard this script before with police, right? Police shoot people. What do they get? More money for training. It's the way you have your cake and eat it too. It's the way you look like you're liberal and you're concerned while you still pump money into the death machine. And so another element of this was, of course, just obscuring the U.S.'s role altogether, just ignoring it altogether. As I wrote about in FAIR in January of 2018, there was a 60 Minutes segment that outright ignored the U.S.'s role in the crisis in Yemen when they did a gut-wrenching segment on mass starvation in Yemen. The segment was entitled, "When Food is Used as a Weapon," and they would portray the U.S. as not only not helping starve the people of Yemen by providing the weapons and the blockade that's killing them, but they actually painted them as the savior. Again, where have we seen this before? We'll get into that with Israel. The segment featured David Beasley, the director of the UN's World Food Program, the organization coordinating humanitarian aid. 60 Minutes host Scott Pelley narrated this, quote, "The U.S. is the World Food Program's biggest donor, so the director is most often an American. Beasley was once the governor of South Carolina," unquote. And Beasley would go on to obscure the U.S.'s responsibility in puff piece interview, stating, quote, "You see, it's chaos, it's starvation, it's hunger, it's unnecessary conflict, strictly man-made. All parties involved in the conflict have their hands guilty. The hands are dirty. All parties," which again is the line that the U.S. government wants to push, because if it's all parties, it's no parties, namely not the United States. The piece did not mention U.S. support for Saudi Arabia once. And this was something 60 Minutes did a few times. Now, the Washington Post did this a few times, where they would talk about the starvation in Yemen. They would mention Saudi responsibility, but they would do a kind of both sides, Saudi and Houthi, blah, blah, blah. But they would completely ignore the U.S.'s role in it altogether because it was inconvenient to a specific narrative.
This narrative has not only reemerged when it comes to the Biden White House and Gaza, but it is ubiquitous across media. Adam and Othman have written about this in The Nation, as Adam mentioned at the top of the show, and I'm going to describe the 3 genres of hand-wringing Biden defense from that article. The first is helpless Biden. So this refers to any report, analysis, or opinion that describes President Biden and his administration as unable to do anything to stop Israel from committing war crimes or end the slaughter overall. This is typically framed as a question of the limits to U.S. power, often accompanied with a picture of Biden looking overwhelmed, sad, or doddering.
He's just kind of unable to really change the course of history. So 10 prominent examples. November 2023, Washington Post, quote, "White House frustrated by Israel's onslaught but sees few options."
November 6th, 2023, the New York Times said, "Biden confronts the limits of U.S. leverage in 2 conflicts."
Also November 2023, Politico, quote, "Why the U.S. isn't stopping the war and other Middle East realities," unquote.
March 2024, the Washington Post said how Biden became embroiled in a Gaza conflict with no end in sight.
April 2024, also the Washington Post, quote, "6 months into Gaza war, Biden confronts the limits of U.S. leverage," unquote.
Later that year, in September of 2024, the New York Times wrote, quote, "Why the world's biggest powers can't stop a Middle East war," end quote.
Can't stop it. September of 2024, the Washington Post, quote, "As Israel escalates in Lebanon, U.S. influence is limited."
Just a few days later, in early October 2024, Politico wrote, quote, "Biden confronts the limits of his influence over Israel," end quote.
October 2024, Washington Post, quote, "How Joe Biden lost his grip on Israel's war for total victory in Gaza," unquote.
And on October 7th, 2024, the New York Times wrote, quote, "A year later, Biden faces the limits of U.S. influence in the Mideast," end quote.
We did a source analysis, which is to say that I literally went through and looked at every source, added them up. 93% of the sources in these articles are either Israeli officials, Biden aides, typically anonymous, or Biden allies in the think tank world. The three most common sources that were cited were, quote, White House and U.S. officials, 47, Israeli officials, 10, or aides or Biden aides, 8. And so these are articles that are fed to reporters by the White House and other Israeli officials who are trying to get progressives, anti-war activists, and the general popular sentiment against the war off their back by acting like the issue of U.S. support is in fact a non sequitur, and also reinforcing the premise that Biden actually wants to end the war but simply can't. Again, a premise that is completely false by Biden's own statements. Just to give one example, New York Times columnist Roger Cohen in September of 2024, he had his headline, quote, Why the world's biggest powers can't stop the Middle East war. And in the piece, Cohen writes, quote, The United States does have enduring leverage over Israel, notably in the form of military aid that involved a $15 billion package signed this year by President Biden. But an ironclad alliance with Israel built around strategic and domestic political considerations, as well as shared values of two democracies, means Washington will almost certainly never threaten to cut, let alone cut off, the arms flow, unquote. So one is compelled to ask then, because this is not saying why he can't do it. It's saying why he doesn't want to do it. So why is the headline why the world's biggest powers can't stop the Middle East war and not why the United States doesn't want to stop the Middle East war? And this conflation of can't and won't is a reoccurring theme one sees in all these articles. And trust me, I read them all. The Washington Post headline was, quote, White House frustrated by Israel's onslaught, but sees few options. And like Cohen, this article acknowledges that these limits are entirely self-imposed, but reduces this fact as some subjective opinion of, quote, many Arab and Muslim Americans, unquote. The Post would go on to say, quote, but administration officials and advisors say the levers the United States theoretically has over Israel, such as conditioning military aid on making the military campaign more targeted, are non-starters, partly because they would be so politically unpopular in any administration and partly because it's a Biden himself has a personal attachment to Israel, unquote. Again, that's tautological. You're just saying he can't do it because he won't do it, but that's just him not wanting to do it. And this is a reoccurring, again, theme. To the extent to which they acknowledge the U.S. has dispositive leverage, they'll say they have dispositive leverage, but they're not using it. But then the headline and the general framing in every quote is saying they can't change it. He's helpless. But he's only helpless because these are the limits he puts on himself. And yeah, I was trying to explain this to Mike Casca on Twitter. He's the chief of staff for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, because I was criticizing her saying that Biden and Harris were tirelessly working on a ceasefire. And I said they were not tirelessly working on a ceasefire because if they wanted one, we would have had one months ago. It is a lie. It is a fiction. And I was trying to put it in terms he understood because I know he's a Dodgers fan. And I said, if Dave Roberts, the manager of the Dodgers, benched Shohei Ohtani, Mookie Betts, Freddie Freeman, right, and the entire starting 9, and then put in the AAA team to play the first round of the playoffs against the Braves or Padres, and then I said, Dave Roberts is tirelessly working for a championship, you would think that was absurd. You would think I was insane, right? He never got back to that point. He never responded. But the point is, if you're preemptively forfeiting your leverage, then you don't really want something. You're certainly not tirelessly working for something. You clearly agree with it. You clearly don't care. Or in Dave Roberts' case, that would be evidence you probably put $10 million on the Padres to win the World Series on FanDuel, right? This would be something that would be highly suspect. If someone said they were working tirelessly for something but forfeited their only real leverage, that would obviously be absurd, but this is the rigmarole and theater that we've been asked to endure for the past 15 months. Which brings us to number 2, which is fuming or deeply concerned Biden. These are any story that alleges behind closed doors or on some scripted call that Biden is very mad at Netanyahu. Conversely, or oftentimes in conjunction, he's very concerned with civilian casualties, and he's very sad. He's very sad about it. And he's also very mad at Israel. And these articles are a dime a dozen, as I'm sure you've seen them nonstop over the last 15 months.
So we're going to read just some choice selections from this particular genre of media coverage. From November 15th, 2023, NBC News wrote, quote, the gap between the Biden administration and the Netanyahu government over Gaza's future is widening, end quote.
December 2023, CNN, quote, unprecedented tensions between the White House and Netanyahu as Biden feels political price for standing with Israel.
January of 2024, Axios wrote, quote, Biden is running out of patience with Bibi as Gaza war hits 100 days, end quote.
February of 2024, Washington Post, quote, Biden moving closer than ever to a breach with Netanyahu over war in Gaza, unquote.
March 2024, CNN wrote, quote, how a brief exchange and a call explains the strained Biden-Netanyahu relationship, end quote.
March 2024, Associated Press, quote, Biden cajoles Netanyahu with tough talk, humanitarian concerns, but Israeli PM remains dug in, unquote.
Also March 2024, Politico wrote, quote, from I love you to asshole, how Joe gave up on Bibi. After decades of building a close personal friendship with Benjamin Netanyahu, Joe Biden has had it with the Israeli prime minister. Now he's hitting him hard, and it may be working, end quote.
May 2024, New York Times, quote, the long tortured road to Biden's clash with Netanyahu over Gaza war.
June 2024, in Axios, quote, White House cancels meeting, scolds Netanyahu in protest over video, end quote.
August 2024, New York Times, quote, killing of Hamas leader fuels more tension between Biden and Netanyahu, unquote. Now, our source analysis for this particular genre of these top 10 articles, and again, there are dozens more of them, found that 98% of the sources of these articles are either Biden aides, typically anonymous, or Biden allies in the think tank world, or Israeli officials or ex-officials. The most popular source for these articles was, you will be surprised to learn, were White House or U.S. quote unquote officials, with 50, Israeli officials 12, and President Biden himself 12. The most consistent stenographer for this particular genre by far was Axios's Barak Ravid, who we counted 25 different versions of this, and we had a very conservative criteria, so it's probably more, where he's either quoting U.S. officials directly or a string of anonymous officials. They're typically presented as scoops, like he's got a big scoop.
Yeah, breaking news.
Yeah. Affirming that the White House and Biden officials are some variation of, quote, breaking with Netanyahu, quote, increasingly frustrated, quote, running out of patience, or, quote, deeply concerned about civilian casualties. These are all direct quotes from his articles. Ravid himself is a former member of Unit 8200, Israel's secretive cyber warfare unit. For his suite of fuming Biden, deeply concerned Biden articles, he was actually awarded the White House Correspondents Association for Journalistic Excellence in April, during which he glowingly posed with President Biden, who, again, they're all getting along because his reporting is not adversarial. He's just laundering whatever the White House wants him to say, which in this case is that Biden is secretly mad, secretly angry, and secretly sad. But the status quo, of course, never changes. The analogy I use in Othman and I use in our Nation article is, in Theater 101, you're taught the difference between a plot and a sketch, right? A plot moves forward, it progresses, characters grow, things change, there's beat changes, right? In a sketch, it's the same gag over and over again. Nothing ever changes by definition, and you use that to draw out the absurdity of the particular situation. So typically 3 or 4 times is kind of the number, right? We are now on 15 months and dozens of articles of what is effectively a sketch. Biden being very sad or very mad at Israel while nothing changes, right? There's never a beat change. There's no escalation. No weapons are ever taken away. They supposedly stopped giving them 2,000-pound bombs for a minute, but then they said actually they have enough to last them a few years anyway. So then that was kind of just purely superficial, which the White House was quick to affirm. So nothing ever changes. So you would think that after like the 40th, 50th, 60th Biden's upset article,
he's almost completely, totally fed up. Almost. There's a break coming.
You would think an editor would be like, what's the news value in this? How is this news? Because it's not news, right? It's a pseudo story. It's supposedly, again, self-serving, anonymous, official fed court intrigue, theory of mind, and a bunch of guesswork as to people's personal feelings. Like, what difference does it make to the average Palestinian in Gaza if Biden's supposedly upset? It makes no difference. It has no material significance or consequence. It's not a change in policy. And they kind of realized this early on in the genre within a few months. And so to make these fuming Biden stories, they would always sort of allude to some imminent break, right? That Biden was about to break with Netanyahu. But of course, we now know that never happened because it was never going to happen because it's fake. It's not real. It's a fake thing. And none of the people who alluded to, or even sometimes explicitly said they were about to break, have ever mention this again. They never go back and say, well, I was wrong, or I was too credulous, because the goal is to just get liberals off your back. And if it looks like Biden's about to either, lock down a ceasefire or break with Netanyahu, then you can they go, well, maybe I won't show up to the protest this week, or maybe I won't get mad. I'll just sort of move on. And that's the function they serve. They're a pressure valve. That is all these articles are. They're a fucking pressure valve. And it worked pretty well. One of the more egregious examples was Peter Baker, the dullard at the New York Times, who does these news analysis where he kind of prints whatever the Biden White House wants him to print, so long as he's protecting his left flank. To the extent to which Baker is critical of Biden, it's from the right, namely over his Afghanistan pullout. And he had a pretty egregious version of this in May 11th, 2024. Peter Baker did a whole fuming Biden story where he said, quote, "To some degree, the Israelis have responded. Despite more than 3 months of vowing to invade Rafah, they have yet to actually do so beyond limited strikes," unquote. And in that article, he says that Biden, quote, "has finally had it with the Israeli leadership that he believes is not listening to him," unquote. And he says he thinks that this strategy is working.
Then, just 3 days later after Baker's report, the Israeli military entered the center of Rafah, quickly turning the city that once had held nearly 300,000 residents into, as NBC News put it, quote, "a ghost town," end quote. And as of August of 2024, data from the Decentralized Damage Mapping Group showed, according to Bellingcat, that, quote, "almost 44% of all buildings in the Rafah governorate in southern Gaza had been damaged or destroyed," end quote. So even the most pro-Biden analysts really now agree that Netanyahu steamrolled through what was then seen as a hand-wringing, fuming, and deeply concerned Joe Biden Rafah red line.
Peter Baker never followed up. Again, he says he thinks it's working. They haven't invaded Rafah. Then they invade Rafah 3 days later, and it's just never talked about again. So one has to ask himself the question, what is more likely, that Peter Baker was reporting on an actual underlying reality of a meaningful break with Biden and Netanyahu, or was he providing PR distance from what Biden knew was going to be horrific images coming out of Rafah in the coming days because Biden knew Israel was about to invade central Rafah, which they, of course, did. And, of course, there was many reports of war crimes. So which of those scenarios is more likely? Is Peter Baker doing public relations for the White House, or was Peter Baker accurately reporting and representing an underlying reality?
We may never know.
The third trope is one that's so ubiquitous, it can't really be analyzed because there's just literally thousands of it, which is third partying, which is presenting the U.S. as a third party in the conflict rather than the country providing the bombs killing 99% of people. An active participant, a disparager of the ICC and ICJ, a disparager of Amnesty International, a provider of military intelligence, provider of aircraft carriers.
It's kind of the mirror opposite of how Iran is described routinely in U.S. media, right? Everything is Iran-backed.
Right.
The, mullahs in Tehran are secretly, puppet masters behind everything that the U.S. or Israel doesn't particularly like. And yet the U.S., who actually provides billions and billions and billions of dollars in weapons, in diplomatic cover for war criminals, is always seen as outside the fray, not influencing policy, not actually an active participant in violence the way that, say, Iran-backed does the work for the kind of sinister, evil Iranians all the time. So this is what we mean by third partying.
Yeah, so the U.S. is presented as a humanitarian force that is trying to mitigate Israel. And the fact that they have this positive leverage and can end it whenever they want is just ignored altogether. It's just not talked about. So you have constantly talking about March 2024, Biden expresses hope on ceasefire talks, but Hamas appears to reject latest offer. These are all from the New York Times.
April 2024, quote, Biden team sees narrow window for deal on ceasefire and hostages in Gaza, end quote.
Quote, Blinken turns up pressure on Hamas to accept Gaza ceasefire deal.
June 2024, quote, Biden's push to end the war in Gaza, end quote.
July 2024, U.S. and Israel voiced new optimism about ceasefire as Gaza talks resume.
August 2024, quote, U.S. push for Gaza ceasefire falls short on key points, officials say, end quote.
September 2024, Biden works around the clock as violence escalates in the Middle East. He's working around the clock, Nima, around the clock. He's literally working 24 hours a day, even though we just found out he has to go to bed at 8 p.m.
October 2024, quote, Hamas says its demands are unchanged as Biden pushes for Gaza ceasefire, end quote.
Right. So Biden's constantly pushing for the ceasefire. But again, he can assert one whenever the fuck he wants. This whole thing is fake. It's all fake. It's not real. What they mean to say is he's pushing for a ceasefire within the limitations of, again, sitting Shohei Ohtani, Mookie Betts, Freddie Freeman, and the starting 9 of the Los Angeles Dodgers. So within that narrow framework of starting the AAA team, he is really, really working to get a championship, but he just can't manage to figure it out. And the absurdity of the situation is just never commented on. Let's look at one example when after Kamala Harris became the nominee and after the U.S. killed Sinwar, the head of Hamas, in October of 2024, Kamala Harris told reporters 2 phrases just seconds apart that are in direct contradiction. And this goes to the heart of what they mean when they talk about ceasefire. When the U.S. says they're pushing for a ceasefire, what they're pushing for is a reiteration of surrender demands. Historically, the word ceasefire means 2 parties cease firing and then they to open up space for negotiation. It is not simply saying you surrender over and over again, which is what the U.S. and Israel mean by ceasefire. She said, quote, "The killing of Hamas leader Sinwar gives us an opportunity to finally end the war. This was immediately followed by, it is time for the day after to begin without Hamas in power."
You're already dictating the terms that happen after negotiations, which happen after a ceasefire.
Right, that's not a ceasefire. That's just you asserting the other side has to surrender. And then again, with the implicit threat, they'll keep killing civilians. And this has been Blinken's line, Biden's line for months, which is Hamas cannot have any role in post-war Gaza. Well, okay. If you believe that, own that. Say what Israeli leaders have been saying, which is we're just going to keep bombing and killing civilians and shredding toddlers until Hamas finally gives up, or anyone, not really Hamas per se, but anyone with a gun, gives up and surrenders and allows Israeli occupation to have, full reign over Gaza. But that's not what they're saying. And so we constantly get this supposed ceasefire talks, even though the U.S. official position contradicts the basic premise of a ceasefire, which is that Israel must 100% win the war, unconditionally win the so-called war, right? The other side must completely surrender, hand over their arms, and go flee somewhere else. And then what the other way they weasel it is they also, by ceasefire, they mean a temporary pause for the purposes of hostage exchanges, with the explicit understanding that they will continue the so-called war until, quote unquote, total victory. And so there's this double game going on where the word ceasefire loses all meaning. It's not related to any underlying reality. But Biden's always pursuing these ceasefires. And again, there's never any details. It's unclear. They meet in Qatar. They meet with some Egyptian officials. And Egyptian officials, by the way, are mitigating this, have repeatedly said that these ceasefires are not real, that they are for public media consumption in the U.S. within Israel. Israel, because Netanyahu wants to get the hostage families off his back, and then the U.S. because, again, they need liberals to look like they're doing something. There's some thingamajig they can point to.
Which is why Biden's working round the clock, Adam.
Tirelessly round the clock. Just 2 a.m., just burn them in oil with Blinken coming up with the terms of surrender. But again, these are just assertion of surrender. This is not a ceasefire negotiation in good faith, because Hamas's position has been they will support a ceasefire and release all the hostages if Israel withdraws from Gaza. Not Israel surrenders, right? Not Israel gives up and, says we no longer exist, right? They just want them to leave Gaza and stop bombing residential buildings and killing entire families. And you see this all the time. This constant firefighter and fire starter dynamic just goes on without question. So let's listen to this clip from CBS News from January of 2024. This is even before they even faked like they cared about the ceasefire. And let's listen to this intro of the so-called Israel-Hamas war.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken is en route to the Middle East again, his fourth trip there since fighting between Israel and Hamas broke out on October 7th. The State Department says Blinken is aiming to prevent the conflict from spreading while expanding humanitarian aid and reducing civilian casualties. Meanwhile, the Israeli military says it has completely dismantled Hamas's military framework in northern Gaza. CBS's Ian Lee has the latest from Tel Aviv.
Good evening, Robert. Secretary of State Antony Blinken arrived in Turkey to a Middle East in trouble. He'll be playing the role of firefighter as he tries to extinguish the conflicts popping up in the region.
So here we have, he's a firefighter putting out fires. Mm-hmm. Again, 99% of the people dying are being killed by American-made bombs, and he's presented not as an active participant in the conflict, which they are, right? The White House is, the U.S. is. They are presented as the exact opposite of reality, which is an agent of peace who's there to stop the hot-headed Orientals from killing each other. But that's not what's happening at all. It's a total inversion of reality, and we see this over and over and over again. Biden pushing for a ceasefire, trying to calm tensions, make sure it doesn't escalate. And that's the absolute opposite of reality.
To discuss this more, we'll now be joined by Dalia Hatuka, a multimedia journalist specializing in Israeli Palestinian affairs.